as a greeting to this very august gathering, I would very much wish to acknowledge the original owners upon whose land this important University of Queensland Bangladesh Association Conference is been privileged to take place. I am making this presentation before this gathering on the theme of taking Bangladesh forward. And in this sense, I would like to acknowledge the generosity of the University of Queensland and the Bangladesh Association as a whole, the organizing committee of the conference, for in fact planning and organizing what is an important event, and as it turns out is the inaugural conference for this enterprise. I would furthermore like to acknowledge Professor Karen Hussey, the Deputy Director of Global Change Institute, who is the chief guest and also the co-host of the conference, and hope that she can herself benefit from the deliberations and share its findings with her colleagues. The presentation which I've been asked to make before this event, Bangladesh Pathways to the Future, is premised on the fact that a significant number of Bangladeshis who are living and studying abroad retain an active interest in what is going on in Bangladesh and have in fact actually initiated research relating to Bangladesh, or which could be beneficial to Bangladesh. So it is very gratifying to in fact be invited by this group to in fact come and share my thoughts on Bangladesh, a country which I've had some share in participating in the emergence of this country, and whose present state and future remains of abiding importance to me, as it does to all of us. Now, what I propose to do over here, since this is a gathering of researchers in particular who wish to be guided in various ways about research opportunities, is to in fact actually first make a presentation on the particular theme of my presentation, and to then suggest a possible research agenda arising out of my presentation. This last part I will not elaborate because in fact I'm taking the liberty of sending on to all of you a paper in which I have put down the thoughts which in fact have guided my presentation today, and where I've annexed a list of research issues which may be of relevance to you arising out of my presentation. Now, the coverage itself, in terms of the paper, addresses three broad issues. One I identify as building on the positive developments which have taken place in Bangladesh in recent years. The second covers issues of sustainability. How can the positives, in fact, be taken forward and provide the basis for a significant transformation as we, in fact, move towards the future. The third, which is related to the issue of sustainability, focuses more specifically on the issue of the growth of inequality and the issues of inclusion, which remains perhaps the principal unaddressed challenge lying before us. Now, let me briefly run through what I identify as the positives. Now, these may be quickly summarized. We, of course, are familiar with what we may regard as steady growth in the GDP. Bangladesh, over the course of the last 15 years, has grown at the rate of 5 to 6%, which by developing country standards is in fact quite commendable. There may be arguments over a few decimal points in these growth rates, but at the end of the day, this in fact has been a process of sustained growth. Secondly, very significant positive would be the export competitiveness, which has been demonstrated over a sustained basis by the Bangladesh economy. And in fact, this export competitiveness has responded to a variety of challenges. The third would be what we term as improved human development indicators. These may be broken down into issues of education, health, and gender empowerment. The fourth I identify as our progress in the reduction of poverty. The fifth we may identify as macroeconomic stability, though here there are contested views on, in fact, how significant the issue of macroeconomic stability may actually be in terms of bringing about significant transformation in the economy. Now, let us begin by looking at some of the key drivers which in fact have contributed to what I identify as the positives. First, we may perhaps take note of global market dynamics, which in fact have influenced our rapid export growth. Global markets have created opportunities over the course of the last 3 decades, as far as Bangladesh is concerned, for accommodating labor-intensive exports. Here, of course, we were initially very considerably benefited by what was known as the multi-fiber arrangement, the MFA, which in fact actually provided us as garment exporters with guaranteed markets based on assigned quotas to particular countries, which may be classified as a form of export protectionism, which in fact greatly influenced the initial rise of the RMG sector as an important exporter. The next and more recent advantage we received was duty-free access to the markets of the European Union under a particular provision known as the Everything But Arms Agreement, which provided access to all of us. The third might be regarded as the continuing global competitiveness of Bangladesh's RMG exports in the post-MFA period, because there was considerable apprehension at one stage that when the MFA was finally phased out, we would have some difficulty in sustaining our position in markets which we had occupied. The second advantage, which you may also see as a problem of global market opportunities, was the opening up of opportunities for exporting labor particularly into the very rapidly growing economies of the oil exporting countries, which went through massive enhancement in their income and development possibilities with the improvements in the price of energy, and the enormous and sustained basis in which this has in fact contributed to the generation of revenue sent home by our migrants. It could be argued that Bangladesh's migrants, along with indeed migrants from many other countries, in fact have become an important factor in the economic and social transformation of the energy exporting countries, particularly in the Gulf regions of the Arabian Peninsula. And in fact, we have been integral to this process as much as the actual wealth they have generated. The second significant feature has been the issue of the private sector as drivers of growth. Now here we have witnessed over the years, though this was not immediately the case, the emergence of an entrepreneurial class which gradually became less dependent on state patronage, and this in turn has impacted on giving a certain space and autonomy of operation to this class. In the first 2 decades of Bangladesh's independence, the entrepreneurial class was heavily patronized and subsidized through loan financing from state sector agencies, which of course in many cases ended badly through the emergence of a loan default culture. But in more recent years, it may be argued that this class has now developed an independent capability for, in fact, reproducing itself over the years. And a collateral of this process has been the growth of private banks as sources of private sector finance. Because here again, this has been a very significant factor. Historically, you were dependent more or less exclusively on financing by public sector specialized institutions and by the publicly owned banks. But now big investment projects are being underwritten by private banks, and in fact actually conclaves of banks coming together to underwrite projects in the private sector which were once unimaginable for their scale. The third important development has been the dynamic rural development sector. Here again, the sort of sub-components of this may be broken down as the tripling, and now tripling plus, production of crop production in the agricultural sector, which has been more or less exclusively driven by small farmers. This has not been a large farmer enterprise. Most of the productivity gains and output gains have come from farmers operating in the range of 2 to 3 acres and below, though of course you have had the emergence of some larger scale farms. Next has been the significant emergence of non-farm growth in the rural sector, which has been a byproduct of agricultural growth, but we have seen a variety of new small-scale industries and service enterprises which have responded to the stimulus provided by agricultural growth. The third has been diversification in the agricultural sector itself, moving away from exclusive dependence on crop agriculture to dairy farming, to, in fact, poultry farming, to, in fact, fish farming, which, in fact, has actually moved away from a riverine base to, in fact, actually a form of crop farming. And fourthly, we would mention, though the benefits of this have been imprecisely estimated, the significant expansion of microcredit or microfinance into the rural economy, which has contributed to the underwriting of both economic activity and a widening of the consumer market for a large segment of the population, and particularly women, at the lower end of the economic scale. The next important driver, the fourth one in this category, would be the construction boom in the public and private sector. In the private sector, an unprecedented housing boom has in fact gone on unabated over the course of the last 3 to 4 decades. And this in turn has witnessed the growth of an increasingly effective private construction industry, which is now building with great facility and with great frequency, multi-storied buildings extending up to 12 to 14 stories, which is a significant advance from an industry which could at best construct nuclear structures of 1 or 2 stories 50 years ago. And they have been absorbing the technologies and technical skills to enable them to undertake such construction. And of course, the considerable enhancement in infrastructure investment, which has been largely driven from public resources, though as I will talk about this later, it has had dimensions of private sector participation. The fifth important factor is investment in human development, which has seen important contributions both of policy and budget investments from the state in the areas of education and healthcare, and at the same time the very significant contribution of the NGOs in promoting improved health awareness, preventative health care, and the spread of knowledge of health, and helped in the enhancement of school enrollment, particularly through the significant contribution of entities like BRAC. The sixth would be categorized as the contribution manifest in gender empowerment. Here we have witnessed the extraordinarily remarkable emergence of gender parity in primary and secondary education, which in fact has actually taken us ahead of India in this particular area, where enrollment rates for girls have certainly taken us ahead of India. The extraordinarily significant and rapid entry of women into the organized labor market. After all, we have to keep in mind that a generation ago, women were confined to the household and were barely seen in public spaces. Women have now come from rural areas with very little exposure to urbanization, have moved into the labor market in the urban sector with great facility, and in fact have become a significant contributor to both industrial and export growth, particularly in the RMG sector. And then again, of course, the significant contribution of microfinance in providing opportunities for income generation and entry of women into the market economy. This, again, has not been significantly appreciated or even adequately quantified. And finally, and I think this is a very significant point, which has been inadequately noted, all the drivers that I have identified above have in most cases managed to remain insulated from the political instability and governance constraints, which in fact have become a significant problem, which I will address in the aspects of providing sustainability to this process. I mean, when everyone within and outside looks at the problems we have faced of a political nature and constantly argue that this will in fact actually inhibit development improvements, all these sectors that I have mentioned have somehow managed to keep growing and remain active in this particular period. It has been quite remarkable in periods of extended strikes and interruption of work that the RMG sector and a variety of other export sectors have actually managed to enhance their exports in this period. So these are issues which should be noted and really merit investigation. Now, having pointed to the positives and identified some of the drivers, let me look ahead now into mapping pathways to the future to see what might be problems of sustainability in this process. And from sustainability, what in fact may contribute to, in fact, value added, which will in fact significantly map out a more promising pathway to the future. The first of the problems of sustainability should be identified as sustaining democracy. Here, we have to recognize the extraordinary problem of confrontational politics, where what we once believed was going to be the strength and stabilizing influence of Bangladesh's democratic journey, the emergence of a strong two-party system in contrast to the multi-parties which create political instability and end up in unstable coalition politics in many emerging countries, was meant to be our great strength. But this has in fact become a major problem, and the two-party system has in fact actually atrophied almost into a tribalized political system in which the divisions have become so deep that in fact a minimal consensual response needed to sustain the democratic process has not been forthcoming. This confrontational politics has in turn led to the progressive dysfunction of the parliamentary system built around extensive boycotts of the successive parliaments by opposition parties, and also the denial of political space within the parliament to the opposition by the ruling party. These processes have now ended up with what we may term as the crisis of ensuring electoral competitiveness. You have had the problem of the last election which took place in Bangladesh in 2014 being boycotted by the parliament, by the major opposition parties of that time. And this ended up in having a parliament in which 153 out of 300 members were actually elected unopposed, so that their representative status could be open to challenge. These processes have been further compromised by the ascendance of money and muscle power in our politics. So even where you have had competitive politics, the massive deployments of money in buying both electoral opportunities and in fact fighting elections, and its corresponding deployment of muscle power, have compromised the quality of our parliamentary elections and the quality of our parliamentary participation. These processes of confrontation and violence have in turn bred what may be termed as a winner-take-all culture, where whomsoever has been in state power has progressively come to practice this in an exclusionary mode, and this has meant both narrowing the political space for the opposition, and in fact actually using their presence in power to grab all the economic opportunities and dominate institutions which normally should have been made more participatory. And of course, finally, and perhaps most dangerously eventually, the weakening of party organizations, which were once the building blocks of Bangladesh's democratic journey. All parties have witnessed a weakening in their organizational capability, with an increasing reliance on their presence in power and the exploitation of power to in fact actually enhance the material opportunities of the party, rather than to in fact concentrate on building a party with strong grassroots base. The second has been the crisis in governance, which is not unrelated to the problems of sustaining democracy. The crisis in governance has manifested itself in severe weaknesses in our administrative capacity. This originates again in the increasing partisanization of the administration, where successive parties have in fact actually attempted to create a segment of loyal administrators, loyal to the party, if not to any particular ideology, and to in fact use these loyalties to in fact make them instruments of administrative advancement. This has correspondingly meant that those who in fact engage in wrongdoing because they think that they have political protection are not exposed to accountability, which of course leads inevitably to impacting on their efficiency and performance. And finally, this compromises the strengthening and building of a merit-based administration, so that at the end of the day, the meritorious in fact assume positions of responsibility, whilst the inefficient and corrupt are in fact actually marginalized. If anything, the reverse of this may have been manifesting itself. Next, we correspondingly, as a byproduct of the problems of democracy and the crisis in the administration, have witnessed the growth of corruption. Corruption has become a byproduct of the dysfunctional political culture, and in fact itself has contributed to the corruption of politics, because where in fact you depend on corruption to accumulate wealth, you then you use this wealth to then accumulate power. So you are caught up in a mutually interactive cycle. State patronage, of course, has then become a central element as an instrument of corruption, where virtually all public expenditures have in fact actually involved some element of patronage, and this in fact has impacted on the quality of projects, on the speed of their implementation. And corruption in turn is impacted on the administration and the impact on service quality. Finally, and interestingly enough, corruption has in fact been contaminating the process of market competitiveness, where in fact people, entrepreneurs who may be normally expected to competitively contribute services and participate in the construction of projects, are not awarded such contracts on the basis of their competitiveness, but are in fact provided opportunities based on political influence. And where, of course, competitiveness prevails, you still have to accommodate the politically influential. Next, we see a problem of the independence of the media. This again has become a more endangered proposition, and this in turn impacts on the degrees of transparency which are associated with an independent media, which in fact can put the spotlight on administrative malfeasance. We then witness the corresponding erosion in the maintenance of the rule of law, where in fact law enforcement agencies are not readily available to provide protection against malfeasance, and in fact may in many cases only intervene if they are provided with financial inducements. And here again the partisanization of the law enforcement agencies becomes a problem. All this has implications for the state of governance, its impact on the quality of administration, and emerges as a growing threat to building up significant accumulation and access to foreign and even domestic investment. The third is the shallowness and weakness of the capital market. Here we see an increasing dependence on bank finance. We correspondingly see a breakdown of the capital market as an instrument of financial intermediation, and this has manifested itself in the progressive corruption of the stock market, and the stock market emerging really not as a financial institution but as a casino, where in fact actually the dices also happen to be loaded. We have witnessed, compared to many neighboring countries, very limited inflows of foreign direct investment, and at the other end of the scale, very inadequate attempts to mobilize small savings as an investment resource, even though there is a significant and growing volume of savings by lower income households. But the financial instruments needed to mobilize this have not really been developed. A significant infrastructure gap has emerged. I would certainly like to acknowledge that this government has recognized this and has made significant efforts at filling this gap in the energy and even in the transport sector. However, the gaps remain massive. Here we have problems of financing infrastructure development. We are increasingly going in for hard-term financing in this sector, which will have long-term problems. We have become more dependent on public-private partnership as an instrument for infrastructure development, where again you have unanswered questions of actually how much of a partnership is there, who actually pays the bills. If in fact the private partner is generating their initial investments by borrowing from public sector banks and is then getting all the opportunities for reaping the profits from this partnership without even having to pay any taxes in the initial period. This does not seem to be a very equitable and efficient partnership. And of course, the eventual problem which has emerged of exceedingly weak state of project implementation, where virtually every major project has significant cost overruns and in fact important and huge time lags in their implementation. We have problems of sustaining export growth here in the RNG sector. We remain dependent on this sector. It accounts for over 80% of our exports, and its narrow reliance on the European Union and US markets. So they have been very slow in penetrating the fast-growing Asian and even the Indian markets, where we have duty-free access now provided by India. We, of course, have problems in meeting labor standards. Here, significant progress has been made in recent years, but this progress has still to adequately respond to the structural challenges which were responsible for the Rana Plaza disaster, and where we may have only dealt with the symptoms of the problem in our remedial measures without addressing the sources of the problems. And then we face the problem of incentivizing the labor force, offering a livable wage, which is still a challenging task, responding to opportunities for profit sharing, which is in fact actually built into the law but is in fact not observed. And finally, what I have identified as a very important issue, making workers stakeholders in the enterprises where they work by offering them a share in its equity ownership. We, of course, continue to depend in our labor exports on low-skilled migrant labor. And this, again, needs to be addressed. We need then to move on to the issue of productivity enhancement in agriculture and small and medium enterprises. Here, again, the issues are enhancing the share of farmers and SME entrepreneurs, even artisans, in the value addition process through integration into corporate and global value chains and institutional reforms to enhance opportunities for sharing in the value addition process. We need to address then quality issues in the human development sector. In education, there is signs of growing inequality in access to quality education, and this is having huge socially disequalizing effects, which will be perpetuated into the next generation. We need to widen access to technical and tertiary education, where advances have been very limited. Quality problems afflict every sector, so even whilst our numerical indicators of advancement in education are very significant, quality aspects remain lagging far behind. Healthcare, again, you have issues of improving quality of public healthcare, growing dependence of lower income households on private healthcare, and the fact that this may be eating into the income and budgets of lower income households who are paying the much higher costs of private healthcare. And of course, our failure even today to universalize access to quality healthcare. As far as gender empowerment is concerned, again, whilst we have made progress, we need to respond to the challenges of patriarchy. We need to respond to the challenges of violence against women. We need to ensure equality for women and protection of the law, where again, while some progress has been made, significant ground has to be covered. We need to build institutions for collective action to promote the empowerment of women. And then again, finally, we need to enhance women's representation in electoral institutions at all levels. Here again, whilst we have reserved seats available to them, we need a much more active and visible participation of women and the creation of space in the parties and in the institutions. We finally need to respond to environmental challenges, the problems of climate change. We have to meet the challenge of adaptability, the financial costs associated with this, where promises are there in great profusion, but very little of honoring at the international level. We need to respond internally to the problems of environmental damage. Here, of course, there are significant technical problems, but the most severe problems will be those of the governance challenge, where we have to take action against violation of our many environmental protection laws, which are weakly enforced because of both weak and corrupt administration by the regulatory authorities. And of course, we need to respond to the challenge of land grabbing by property developers and the issue of politically influential people now taking advantage of the rising price of land to in fact actually usurp the land rights of the weak and the poor. Here the issues of political economy and its consequences for environmental damage in fact remains a major unaddressed issue to be studied. Finally, let me address the issues of inequality and inclusion. Measuring inequality in all areas is a problem. Reliability of data is there. This has also been compounded by conceptual issues. We have been unable to satisfactorily distinguish between the symptoms and sources of poverty and growing inequality. We have taken insufficient cognizance of the contribution of inequitable access to assets, the unequal participation of people in the market, particularly the low-income households and producers, unequal access to health and educational opportunities, unjust governance, where you have one quality of governance for people with money and influence, and a different order of governance to the underprivileged. We still face problems of gender injustice, even though advancement might have been made. And of course, there is the wider issues of global injustice. We are still operating in a highly inequitable global institution where rent-seeking opportunities of the established powers are very considerable, and the institutions of global governance are dominated by the traditional rich nations. We need to correspondingly address limitations in the astructural response to poverty and inequality, because virtually all policy initiatives are built around correcting symptoms rather than addressing the sources of the problems. And of course, we need to become fully aware of the socio-political implications of growing inequality, because what is happening now is that what was relatively less unequal society has become increasingly inegalitarian. It has become, we have created an elite class, which has in fact perpetuated itself through its hold over political power and a virtual division of this society along these lines. And finally, of course, we need to meet the challenge of democratizing democracy, because there is no meaningful democracy in a country if in fact all your institutions of democracy are captured by the rich, and in fact the lower and more numerous lower income households simply become voting fodder rather than in fact equal participants in the decision making process and the benefits of democracy. So these are some of the challenges we face. We will have to see how we respond to these. I would hope that this will give you some thoughts to guide your research agenda. Here I have assembled a series of research challenges for you. I will have these circulated. I have asked the association to do that. So in conclusion, I would simply point to the fact that out of the presentation I have made, I have identified a number of key research challenges. Here I will certainly not run through the full list of specific research proposals I have enumerated, but really summarize the heads under which I have put them together. The first of these is to stress the need to deepen understanding of drivers of growth through more research, and I have identified a series of 5 subtopics. Then the issue of financing investment for growth, I think, is an appropriate agenda. Here I've identified a series of 5 subtopics. The third is export growth and diversification. Here I've identified 3 topics with quite a number of subtopics built around them. And fourth is research on the dynamics of poverty reduction and income inequality. Here I've identified a number of subheads which can be taken up. And finally, I leave to you the unaddressed issues in the identification of research topics, because by definition I have only been able to identify a limited number of issues, but you can use your imagination by looking at the presentation I have made and trying to put together your own research ideas. I hope the presentation has been of some use to you in providing understanding of the state of Bangladesh today, where there is promise and opportunity as well as challenges, and that this will in fact provide you with some guidance on research issues for you to take up. Here I've identified some general issues, and I have tailored a few of the issues to those of you who may want to draw on your presence in Australia to in fact actually construct a research program related to Bangladesh. The annex itemizing these research programs will be circulated to you. So I wish you well in the conference, and I look forward to hearing about its outcome. Thank you for having me.